By way of context, as you have already heard, I should say that I am a historian by training, and I'm a historian of South Asia and the British Empire. And I work primarily at the intersections of science, technology, medicine, and media. So a good chunk of my work to date has been concerned with trying to understand how 19th and early 20th century technologies of communication, like the electric telegraph and the telephone, were incorporated into journalism, medical practice, and public health. So in this connection, I have worked quite a lot with what I like to call the media of science, especially scientific periodicals, but also the popular press, in an attempt to reconstruct some of the science communication practices of the past. And today's talk is based on work I did as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Oxford, where I was part of a 5-year ERC project called Diseases of Modern Life, which basically explored 19th century medical and cultural responses to the phenomena of stress and overload, with which I think we are familiar, many of us. And we were involved in many public engagement activities, including the creation of a children's book about media and telecommunications history, which was followed by a documentary theater performance on the same topic, as well as a cabaret and the film on contagion, as you can see in this slide. Now, one of the topics I investigated as part of that project were public concerns about infection by telephone, within inverted commas, which became conspicuous in the British medical and popular press from around the 1880s until the outbreak of World War I, although similar reports were also circulating in other countries such as the US, Germany, and France. This period coincided with the introduction and the expansion of the telephone network in Britain. So it was a time when people were getting used to a new technology of communication, not unlike nowadays. And equally importantly, it was also a time of rampant tuberculosis and regular epidemic outbreaks of influenza, smallpox, or diphtheria. We should remember that although Robert Koch discovered the tubercle bacillus in 1882, this did not immediately translate into a cure for tuberculosis, which remained a public health problem of enormous significance. So palliative care and prevention, including hygienic practices like prohibiting public spitting, disinfection, and ventilation, played an important role in attempts to tackle it. And furthermore, even after the identification of the bacillus, the actual mechanisms of transmission of tuberculosis remain unclear, which means that new and old ideas about germs, fomites, dust, and even heredity and alcoholism were often combined to explain the spread of infection. In this context, some people started to fear that telephones, especially public telephones, so both the instruments which changed many hands and were held closely to the face and mouths, as well as the closed call offices, which were poorly ventilated, could spread infectious diseases, for example, by acting as fomites when they became contaminated with different pathogens, or by trapping what was called tubercular dust, which was then inhaled. And these concerns were highlighted in the press, eventually prompting medical authorities, post office officials, and telephone companies in Britain to launch a string of investigations into the possibility of contracting tuberculosis, diphtheria, and other infectious diseases through the use of telephones. So what my research did was to reconstruct these debates and the medical experiments associated with them. And you can see here a drawing of a TB patient who was made to speak into the telephone, after which the instrument was washed with sterile water, and these washings were injected in guinea pigs to establish whether they developed TB afterwards or not. And on the basis of this kind of investigations, it was eventually proclaimed that telephone use was safe, even though not all the results actually turned out to be negative. And then this information was further publicized once more via the medium of the specialist and general press. So what lessons can we learn from such historical examples that might benefit contemporary science communication practices, especially those related to public health? For one, that many of the anxieties that we find ourselves experiencing firsthand also beset our predecessors. We are clearly not the first ones reach for the disinfectant to clean our now mobile phones and electronic gadgets, even if the latest research appears to suggest that the risk of SARS-CoV-2 transmission by such fomites is relatively low. But beyond such, I suspect, rather short-lived reassurances, what the current pandemic has also demonstrated is that commentary about public health, originating both with the specialist and the non-specialist public, is rarely history-free. And this is somehow ironic, considering that in many countries, past epidemics have been almost completely erased from public memory. But it also points, I think, to the role that historians and perhaps medical humanities researchers more generally can and should play, not only in helping to restore the memory of such events, but also helping to illuminate how certain theories of disease transmission and public health measures came into being in the first place. And perhaps the best example of this is the ongoing debate about the airborne nature of COVID-19 and the difference between droplets and aerosols, which has had significant implications for public health policies. As I'm sure you know, the cutoff size of 5 microns has been accepted as a given in the medical community for decades. Although it took the multidisciplinary work of scientists and historians to figure out how it came into being in the first place, and also question the usefulness of that distinction. So what this suggests is that familiarity with the history of research on respiratory diseases transmission can have an impact on contemporary public health policies and the way in which they are communicated to the public. It's also interesting that this research on COVID-19 reveals that tuberculosis has remained, perhaps unsurprisingly to a certain extent, the, I quote, reference standard for airborne infection. And the experiments I have discussed very briefly earlier were part of this longer ongoing attempt to illuminate the actual mechanisms of transmission of tuberculosis and other respiratory diseases. And finally, as medical and social phenomena, epidemics tend to be highly mediatized events. And this is both a good and a bad thing. In the example I discussed, the press played an important role in articulating, but also creating and amplifying concerns about the role of telephones in spreading infectious diseases. Then, like now, the media represented an important source of information on scientific issues. And in fact, the scientists themselves were important science communicators. The press brought a potential public health issue to the attention of the authorities and pressured them to spring into action. At the same time, however, it also peddled sensationalism and stereotypes which fomented fear, to the point that fear became almost as contagious as disease itself. Scientific uncertainty was communicated usually across press reports that contradicted each other rather than within the same piece of news. And so in this gap of scientific, but also to a large extent bureaucratic uncertainty, enterprising individuals found an opportunity for financial gain by designing and marketing a bewildering array of disinfecting products that were then advertised with the help of both the popular and the medical press, for whom advertising remained the main source of revenue, and which sat a bit awkwardly alongside reports that telephones were safe, all of them, as the press proclaimed. And with this, I have come to the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening. And I'm looking forward to your questions. Let me just stop the sharing so I can see. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this fascinating lightning talk. For all the participants who have just joined us, we ask you to pose your questions for Dr. Amelia Bonea in the chat. Otherwise, I will go first while you have still some time to think about your questions before we move on to the next speaker in a few minutes' time. So I was wondering, You were even ahead of the time. You mentioned there were some really scarily familiar parallels with how we're experiencing the pandemic right now. I'm wondering if you can look a little bit into the future based on your historic research. What happens next?
I usually shy away from making predictions about the future, I have to say. And because the one thing that I always like to emphasize as a historian is that context matters. So there are many parallels, between the past and the present. And perhaps, for myself as well, it's been quite reassuring to be able to draw on the past and say, look, this has happened before, right? But we also have to understand that, the political and socioeconomic context is different now from what it used to be then. For one thing, what I'm talking about is also Victorian and Edwardian Britain. So that was the period of, British Empire. Technologies themselves weren't the same, right? I mean, although we compare often the electric telegraph to the internet of the 21st century, it was clearly not the same technology that you had at home, and everyone could use. And information didn't travel that fast like nowadays. So people had more time to act upon, say, misinformation, false news as they were called at the time. But also the diseases themselves weren't the same. And you can see this, nowadays with this virus that it keeps changing and mutating. So, but the one thing that fascinates me, nevertheless, is how little people change, in fact, in some respects. And I can see this, this pandemic is not even over. And I've seen other colleagues of mine who are saying that the world is going to be a fundamentally different place. And it's striking that actually people are so resistant to changing their way of life, that they were so eager to take their masks off, even though the pandemic is not over. So it's, I don't want to make predictions also because I'm not a scientist. So.
Yeah, I think there was a question in the chat. Okay, it's a bit of a longer question. I am going to read it out to you because I'm not quite sure if you can see it, but also so that everyone can hear it. So Linda Grein, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, asks, I wonder how much integrity we can expect from journalists in times of crises. I think it's important not to make the public panic. I understand they need to be critical, even for scientists, but I feel that oftentimes journalists have mostly spread panic, leading to distrust and even mental health issues in the general population. What do you think about this?
I think that not some journalists, but not all journalists. It would be unfair to say that all journalists do this. And in fact, if you look at the history of journalism, there have been mechanisms in place for, fact-checking information, right? So it is true that, sensationalism is a problem, and it's you could see it even now, even, with newspapers like The Guardian in the UK, that they would highlight, the headline would highlight a piece of information that's, meant to draw attention, but somehow distort the actual content of the article if you're going to read it in detail, right? So it is true, but I don't think that happens all the time. But the other problem is that nowadays journalism is changing a lot with the introduction of information technology. So, this is somehow akin to what happened in the 19th century when the telegraph was brought into play, because journalists themselves needed to change and to adapt and to find new ways of dealing with this misinformation, the way that it spread faster than it had before, right? So these are things that, ourselves as well as the public, we need to work on to become more media literate. How are we going to use these technologies? Even including, how are you using social media? Are you yourself fact checking your own, posts before you share them? Are you looking at the source? These kind of things that are, I think, very important to do.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have to cut you off there, which my heart is bleeding to do so. I saw that there was another question. Maybe you can take it with you and can continue the conversation after our meeting. Awesome. So now I would like to welcome to the virtual stage Samantha Fowler. And just to introduce our speaker, she is joining us virtually from Laurentian University, which I have found out after a little bit of research online is also known as the academic resort due to its beautiful location in Canada. And she is working as a science communicator within a project on culturally relevant measures of health and well-being for Indigenous children. and has background in psychology. She obtained her master's degree from the University of Waterloo and finished a master's degree of science communication at Laurentian University. And now I would like to ask Samantha to unmute herself and come onto the virtual stage.
All right, hello. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. My name is Samantha Fowler. Today I'll be presenting my master's research that was completed in the Masters of Science Communication at Laurentian University. The general idea of my research is that before effective science communication efforts can truly begin, we as science communicators must understand our audience and the messages currently being shared so we can effectively target and combat them. Given that vaccination hesitancy poses a major threat to global health and the potential influences of the COVID-19 pandemic on strengthening and growing these communities, this study aimed to create a fundamental audience analysis of vaccination hesitancy. What I did was I explored a snapshot of 2 prominent public vaccination hesitant Facebook pages in North America during the beginning of the COVID-19 global pandemic to see what they were saying and how they were saying it. Vaccine hesitancy is the delay in acceptance, reluctance, or refusal of vaccination regardless of availability or access to vaccination services. Unfortunately, I believe a lot of us know this term, but you will often hear me say instead of vaccine hesitancy, vaccination hesitancy, which better represents diverse concerns of personal action and was a recommendation of the SAGE working group from the World Health Organization. For example, vaccination hesitancy is much broader than just fear of the vaccine itself. It has to do with civil liberties, fear of needles, fear of losing the rights you have, fear of the processes and a lack of trust in the medical profession as a whole. And it's so much bigger than just the vaccine, which is where I often use the term vaccination hesitancy. I selected the time period of March 1st to May 31st, 2020 as representative of the start of the pandemic for 2 kind of key reasons. Firstly, Google Trend data was analyzed and showed a rapid increase in related searches related to the COVID-19 pandemic beginning March 1st. If you look at the actual graph of Google Trend data, searches for vaccine, COVID-19, coronavirus, they just skyrocketed and were almost non-existent in North America prior to March 1st. Also, March was when key public health measures began to be enforced in North America. These measures included closure of public schools and non-essential establishments, recommendations for physical distancing, and emergency declarations. These important changes directly impact day-to-day life and create the necessary social and political context for influencing vaccination hesitancy. I conducted a search for prominent English North American Facebook pages using the search term vaccine. All types of Facebook pages were considered. Public Facebook pages were chosen because all posts and comments are publicly available and anyone can see them without joining the page. The 2 pages that were studied were Vaccine Facts, which identifies as a health and wellness website. You can identify this on the Facebook page, but there was no real biography, description, or contact information about this page. In contrast, the other page studied was Vaccine Choice Canada, which identifies as a medical and health page and represents a not-for-profit educational society, or what they call an educational society within Canada. Vaccine Choice Canada lists a clear mission statement and contact information to their website. I analyzed 556 posts and determined 443 of these posts and their 6,109 comments were related to the COVID-19 pandemic due to keyword use. It's important to note that the majority of these posts had some relation or mention, about 60 to 80% of the posts had during this time period on these pages talked about the COVID-19 pandemic in various terms, including talking about the vaccines, social distancing, mask wearing. I used qualitative coding to analyze the Facebook posts and comments for emergent themes. I felt the posts alone did not accurately represent community beliefs, as they may be generated by a small number of page moderators and administrators. In contrast, comments reflected the beliefs and reactions of the community to the information that was presented to them in posts and are better representative of the actual thoughts of the community itself. Results were organized into 2 categories: what was being discussed and how it was being discussed. Although all of these posts came from Facebook pages that were dedicated specifically to vaccination hesitancy, the topics shared in posts and comments varied. Vaccines were one of the largest single categories, but 80% of posts on vaccination hesitant Facebook pages were related to topics other than vaccines during the pandemic. Other prominent topics included talking about the national lockdown, testing and tracking, and various information about how COVID-19 is spreading. I used a similar approach to similar studies that examined social media trends of vaccination hesitancy, and I used an adapted health belief model from Shapiro et al. 2017 as a deductive a priori framework for coding. For example, this framework helped break down exactly how to see the health belief model within Facebook posts. So where the health belief model talks about perceived susceptibility, the actual Facebook post or comment would talk about how someone feels that they are not susceptible or to the disease, or no one's going to catch this, we will all be fine. When actually breaking down all of these different categories in the health belief model, in terms of their frequency of code in both posts and comments, mistrust was by far the most discussed topic within the health belief model. People were talking about how they mistrust the government, how they mistrust the medical professionals, how they mistrusted teachers, and the reasons why teachers were closing schools. Mistrust with the pandemic, and at least on these pages, was very broad, very diverse. Other categories that were really prominent include the perceived harms of the vaccines and public safety protocols, and how all of these undermined their basic civil liberties and rights. Wearing masks, vaccines, not allowing them to go to stores. People believed that they had these fundamental rights and that these were undermining these civil liberties. Based on the actual study, this is the chart that I showed before with the health belief model with the basic breakdown and how this was adapted into Shapiro et al.'s model for studying vaccination hesitancy in social media. I found that there were 3 additional categories that needed to be studied. These included specifically low individual risk perception, perceived lack of authority, and alternatives. Low individual risk perception was talking about not just low susceptibility in general, but low susceptibility for the individual. That yes, people are going to get sick. Yes, COVID is going to spread. Yes, it's going to be bad, but I will be fine. That's what matters most. I will be fine, and thus I choose not to follow the public health protocols. Perceived lack of authority talked to, and as opposed to external cues to action, where someone came on the page and said, where they were looking at specific influencers and people who said, oh, don't get vaccinated. A perceived lack of authority was when people were saying, do get vaccinated, do follow social public health protocols, but they found that these people had this perceived lack of authority. For example, Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg was very vocal during the pandemic, just speaking about why it's important to follow public health protocols. And this is a post from Vaccine Facts in April 2020 that is basically reasoning because Greta Thunberg has a perceived lack of authority to this group, therefore we can choose to discredit the entire message. Similarly, this was shown with Bill Gates and Melinda Gates, who have no authority in medical background, and thus when they said to get vaccinated, we can just discredit the whole message, and because they have a perceived lack of authority. And the final one on here is alternatives, as this was a really prominent topic on these pages where people were talking about alternatives to vaccines, specifically how the theory of natural herd immunity, that if we just let enough people get sick, then we will gain herd immunity similar to the way herd immunity is gained in vaccines. And this message was often shared on these pages, although it has no real scientific background. Results in terms of how it was discussed. This is a quote from one of these Vaccine Choice Canada. I'm happy to find some people who don't think I'm crazy for thinking this lockdown is stupid and unnecessary. People really felt community in these groups where they felt they could share things that they couldn't share elsewhere, which is one of the reasons it's so important to go to these pages to study these thoughts, because they might be sharing thoughts that they don't share elsewhere. However, although these people found that they talked often about safe spaces and community building, the vaccination hesitant communities created toxic environments filled with ad hominem attacks towards public figures, pro-vaccine commenters, and any in-group members who disagreed even slightly. One of my favorite examples is someone commented on a spelling mistake in a post and they were attacked. And there was frequent negative emotions with violence, anger, references to stupidity and idiocracy, and extreme comparisons to things like the Holocaust and rape. Overall, vaccination hesitant pages fund these anti-science communities where these perceived safe spaces feel that they can talk about anything and everything in it. These anti-science communities resulted from two key thought processes: these perceived safe spaces and an overall misunderstanding of the scientific process. Such as a mistrust in authority figures for expressing changing views based off of changing evidence, and focusing on cues to action that support pre-existing beliefs long beyond when they've been discredited. Overall, this study performs a fundamental audience analysis of what people are saying, and specifically in North America, around COVID and around vaccines, and can be used to develop more effective science communication tools in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There were already some questions coming in. So I have about 1 million questions burning on my mind, but I'm going to read this listener's question. It's quite a long one, but let's see. What would you say about some doctors unjustly talking against the COVID vaccination, with which some anti-vaxxers show as evidence? Note, some of COVID vaccine hesitancy is quite justified as for groups of people with autoimmune diseases, for example, ME, CFS, for which scientists are currently collecting adverse effect data on. It is true that some autoimmune disease patients are recommended by their doctors not to get it or to postpone it, rightfully so. I'm just going to see if I can jump.
Yeah, I think the rest of the question there is talking specifically about this specific autoimmune disease. And I think this goes back to this idea of misunderstanding of fundamental scientific processes within these communities, where even if a doctor justly comes out and says there might be some risk for this specific community, there is a lack of understanding of generalizability and limitations in studies. There's also this frequency of looking at specifically just short posts and not actually reading articles, fact checking, reading the original source. And this general mistrust of if one person says something that's slightly wrong, then the whole thing must be wrong. There's this blowing out of proportion and inability to see and accept changing scientific evidence within these communities. And I think a lot of times what's in these communities, they build off each other because they feel like it's a safe space. As soon as they see one person saying it, they kind of rile each other. You can build this community thought process. I definitely agree with this idea that a lot of some COVID vaccine hesitancy is quite justified. Here in Canada, we often look at vaccine education within Indigenous populations, where vaccines and the medical industry have violated Indigenous people's rights in the past. And there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy in these communities. And there's actually a tendency within Canada to refer to not vaccination hesitancy in these communities, but instead focus wording on vaccine education. So instead of saying this is a vaccine hesitancy campaign, saying this is a vaccine education campaign, and really looking at how we can work with specific audiences to deal with their specific concerns. And that specificity is very important. And I'm glad for the commenter who's also happily vaccinated. I have one of my 2 vaccines now, and I am happily half vaccinated and eager for the second part.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There is a second question. I'm not sure if, you maybe want to briefly answer this question, so then we move on with our next speaker duo.
I think one of the best ways to engage with vaccination hesitant groups, at least based on my research, is really choosing the right time and place and being very specific in where you talk. For example, there was many pro-vaccine and pro-public safety protocol people who came on these pages and commented and tried to have conversations and debates with these people, with vaccination hesitant people within these communities, and they were immediately shut down and attacked. So it's about finding the right time and place. Vaccination hesitant Facebook pages is probably not the right time and place to engage with these groups, but having actual leaders within their community to work. So this is a big thing with Indigenous peoples here in Canada, where we work with chiefs and elders first, and then have the chiefs and elders educate their communities themselves. Choosing that right time and place is essential.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk, and please everyone join me in giving a virtual round of applause to Samantha Fowler. So yeah, I will go ahead and introduce our next speaker duo. Let's welcome together Dr. Anne Reif, who is visiting us virtually from the TU Braunschweig, where she is a research associate at the Institute for Communication Science. Her doctoral work looked at trust in science, changing conditions through science communication in online environments. And if I understood correctly from my online research, she is about to start an exciting DFG-funded project with the University of Hamburg on trust relationships between science and digitized publics. Welcome, Dr. Anne Reif, and also a warm welcome to Dr. Lars Guenther from the University of Hamburg and Stellenbosch University, who's a postdoc in communication science and an associate professor at the Center for Research on Evaluation Science and Technology of Stellenbosch University. Yeah, welcome both of you to the virtual stage. I invite you to now unmute yourselves and take it away.
All right. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. Perfect. So hello, everyone. And thanks for the introduction. Together with Lars Guenther, I'd like to present you some fresh findings on different online user segments for trust in science in South Africa during the current pandemic. This project, which is an online survey amongst the South African public, is a cooperation between Stellenbosch University and TU Braunschweig, and it's a starting point, as we've heard already, for the new project Trusty at TU Braunschweig and University of Hamburg, and the research team you can see here on my slides. As we all know, and is widely debated also during this conference, trust in science is a key variable for science communication and our society in general. It's especially important during times of crisis, such as the current pandemic, and which is in combination also with the current trends of science communication, including conspiracy theories online, likely also to affect public trust in science. And however, and despite the often discussed decrease in trust caused by the use of online media, empirical data so far and before COVID-19 has pointed towards a stable level of trust in different countries, and also a vast increase at the beginning of the pandemic, increase in trust. But these global public surveys have also been criticized in the past for their measures, for example, single item measures for trust, and also for the aggregated analysis. And we therefore assume that segmentation studies are needed because there's not just the one public of science communication. And we further are convinced that we need to consider the diverse practices of science communication, especially online use, and use trust in science in a differentiated way, and also as a segmentation variable. The South African public is a special case regarding attitudes or general perceptions of science and technology. And so far, there's little known about trust in science or on different publics of science communication. And thus, we address two different research questions here. We want to know what segments of South African publics can be distinguished regarding public trust in science, and if they perceive difference or perceive a change in trust differently due to COVID-19. To answer these questions, we conducted an online survey at the end of last year using an English questionnaire. And we got the data from more than 1,600 South Africans and conducted a k-means cluster analysis, ANOVAs, regression analysis, and a chi-square test. Our measurements for trust in science and the use of different types of science communication was based on our theoretical model. And here we distinguish between different levels and dimensions of trust in science, and we measure different ways to get in contact with science directly, for example, by speaking to a scientist, or by mediated contact via social agents, friends and family, via the journalistic media, and as well as via social media, which is a kind of a mixed type of contact. And we also considered people's trust in these different types of science communication. And as a result of our trust analysis, we find 5 different types of trust segments. The first and biggest segment are the trusting insiders, who almost completely trust in science. They have the highest level of interest and knowledge, and they have studied at university or college and have been working in science or are working in science actually themselves to a high proportion. The second segment are the trusting friends. They have the highest, or the second highest level of trust, and they especially value scientists for their expertise. Their interest and knowledge about science is rather high, and most of them own a university degree or have met scientists personally. The trusting optimists also have a rather high trust in science, and for them, scientists' integrity and benevolence are most important. They have a similarly high interest and knowledge compared to the second group, but they are the youngest group, and again, many of them have a university degree. The next 2 groups are very different in their trust. And in these groups, only few of the people own a university degree, and few of them know scientists personally. So one group, they are undecided about their trust, and they have a moderate level of interest and knowledge. And the last group and the smallest group are the suspicious, disengaged, who have the lowest level of trust. And for them, expertise is actually the only reason to trust scientists. When looking at the different types of contact, we found that the groups are almost sorted in the same order compared to what we see now for trust. Starting with the trusting insiders, who come most frequently into contact with science by these diverse types of contact, and they name diverse types of contact as their preferred source of information about science. The suspicious, disengaged, in contrast, they use the different types of science communication, and they trust those types of science communication the least. The results of the regression analysis for each group further show that the frequency of contact has hardly any effect on those groups' trust, but it highlights the importance of direct contact, with science having at least a slightly positive effect on their trust in science. And interestingly, we found that the last group, the suspicious, disengaged, they show moderate effects for the diverse types of contact. Here, not only there is a higher frequency of direct contact having a positive effect on their trust, but also the contact via social media. They more frequently they use first journalistic media has a positive effect on their trust, but only if they actually trust the media outlets. And there is an opposite effect for social media use. The more frequently they use social media to hear something about science, the less they trust in science if they actually trust the information they hear on social media. And answering the second research question, only about half of the sample answered the open-ended question about a perceived change in trust due to COVID-19. And for each segment, actually a substantial number of people either have experienced a decrease in trust due to COVID-19, or they haven't experienced any or not much of a change. And the biggest proportion for the, again, quite interesting suspicious disengaged, they have experienced a negative shift in their personal trust in science due to COVID-19. So far, we can conclude that there are different digitized publics that vary in trust and the use of science communication in South Africa. Trust in science and the frequency of different types of contact with science seem to go in a way hand in hand with each other. And although direct contact, like speaking to a scientist, is often the least frequent type of contact with science, it is especially important for South Africans' trust in science, which can be seen as an indicator for the positive effect of public engagement with science. Other types of contact, as we have heard, have hardly any effect on trust, except for the suspicious disengaged, who are also the ones whose trust may have been affected most negatively by COVID-19. And many of the other groups, as we've seen, also have perceived a decrease in their trust, despite we've actually measured quite high trust in science during the pandemic. And how this trend continues needs, of course, further observation. And besides qualitative analysis of the given reasons for the possible changes in trust, we will next focus on cultural differences, such as the role of religion. And for Germany, we do not expect to see what we've seen actually for South Africa, because we've seen that the trusting insiders, interestingly, are also the ones who are most religious. So now we thank you very much for your attention and are looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. And I saw your work is currently under review, so I wish you speedy peer review. Yeah, I have quite a few questions that immediately came to mind, but I want to give, of course, space to our attendees to ask your questions now. So if you have any question, just post it in the chat. In the meantime, I will go first. So I saw, well, you already mentioned it a little bit, but I'm wondering what your expectations are regarding your model and your findings in other cultural contexts, and also specifically if you think that the effect of social media and also kind of various different types of social media might be different for different cultural contexts as well.
Lars, do you want to?
Yes, I can start. It's basically an open question. We do think that we will find different segments for Germany, but I think we are quite certain that there will also, I mean, there's always the segment that has the highest trust, and then there's also the segment that has the lowest trust. I think that will be the same in Germany, but it might be different in frequencies. But the interesting question, and actually, is what happens in the middle. And there I expect actually to find some differences between South Africa and Germany based on different factors, like Anna said in her presentation. It could be based on religious beliefs. I guess that's an important question. And then for the rest, I guess we will have to wait and find out in the future.
Yeah, very exciting. Thank you. Also so encouraging as science communicators. It's super exciting to see the positive effect of direct science communication. So there was a question in the chat from Dana Wasserbacher, which I'm going to read out to you. At first glance, your approach has a very traditional image of science communication. One-directional citizens have to inform themselves and approach science via websites, social media, and contacting scientists. Did you reflect this in your study? Did you also investigate on perceptions of trust in different modes of engaging with science?
Yes, we have I mean, we didn't have the time to go into detail, of course, but yes, we've also measured especially how they use different types of online media, whether they use online media actively, like posting something online or commenting something on scientific issues, or also using Google or other search engines to find out about science. So we've got not just like the traditional how they inform, like the one-directional side, but also a more like an online engagement with science approach.
Well, and also when it comes to reception, we actually tested, I don't know, 20, 25 different sources of information, and some of them are more engaging and interactive and some of them are not. We just, like for today, we didn't have the time to go into detail here.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. It sounds like there's lots of more exciting results to watch out for and to come. So I would like to invite everyone to thank our speakers virtually with a round of applause. And I will go ahead and introduce our next speaker, who is Dana Wasserbacher, who is joining us virtually from the Austrian Institute of Technology. She is a junior expert advisor at the Austrian Institute of Technology and please, Dana, correct me if I'm wrong, pursuing her master's degree in environment and bioresources management at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna. And she is currently working within the Foresight and Technology Monitoring Project for the Austrian Parliament. With her is Jan Röder, and he is a research associate of the Competence Center Foresight and has studied history and computer science for the humanities at the University of Cologne. And now, in order not to take away from your precious speaking and Q&A time, I will give the word to you, Dana.
Thank you, Anna. I'm sorry that we confused you. With us is also Michela Vignoli. She's also from the Austrian Institute of Technology. And as she will start with the presentation, I give her the word to introduce herself. Michela, please.
Gorgeous. Thanks a lot, Dana. Yes, I'm a colleague of Dana, also at AIT, Austrian Institute of Technology, and I'm an expert of open science and also digged a lot into the question about what science communication means in context of open science. Thanks a lot, first of all, to give us the opportunity to present the results of this explorative study that we did about identifying reliable foresight knowledge from online news articles. In the next slide, I want to give you just a very brief introduction about some observations that we did before we started the study, actually. And I think this is nothing new. I don't need to go into detail here because we've heard it today a lot. So basically, COVID-19 had a clear impact on science communication and the media. What we observed is that public audiences and journalists showed increased interest in scientific advances and also forward-looking findings. And we noticed an increased visibility of individual researchers. Some examples are, of course, for the German-speaking media landscape, virologist Christian Drosten, or for the English-speaking media, Anthony Fauci. In the next slide, I want to briefly tell you what we did exactly. So our plan, our goal was to explore the potential of machine learning methods to answer the following question. So can machine learning help us to find evidence for the increased frequency of the forward-looking statements and the visibility of the experts that we observed as said before in those online news articles? And also, can machine learning and the analysis of contextual data help provide some insight for the scientific evidence base of the identified statements? For that, we used a data set of English language news articles that were aggregated from a wide range of publishers, for example, The Economist, BBC, CNN, and we focused mainly on the COVID-19 related news items of 2020. Based on our results, we discussed challenges and opportunities that arise in the sense-making and evaluation process of forward-looking knowledge for science communication. In the next slide, I will just briefly tell you what we really did to tackle this. So first, we identified the forward-looking statements and experts making these statements in the online newspaper data that I mentioned before. Then we compared the results with scientific publication record in the dimensions database to get some indication of the scientific background of the expert and also to get an idea about the scientific evidence base of the statement. And based on the results, then we discussed the potential of this approach for identifying evidence-based foresight knowledge in contemporary news articles, and also beyond that, what the potential is for knowledge assessment in context of foresight and science communication research. And with that, I hand over to our colleague Jan Röden, who will explain you the machine learning approach that we took.
Yes, thank you, Michaela. Thank you for the introduction in this project. And I'm now going to give you a short overview on the machine learning approach that we used. And I'm going to skip many things because I can't talk very fast. So basically, we start out as many projects with the data set creation, which in our work involves manual annotation of data sets and breaking up news articles into shorter paragraphs that are easier to analyze and more comprehensive. We then trained a neural network to identify forward-looking statements from those articles. It was actually a multi-iterated feedback loop. So we trained the model, evaluated the results, fed them back into the results to improve it, and so on. I think we did 2 rounds of this. And then we classified all the other articles that we had available, which are 390,000 of them. And we actually try to balance this data set. So we have data from the English-speaking world, we have data from Southeast Asia, from different European countries, and for the further book, we are also going to include sources from the African continent. And then in the 4th step, we actually did some enrichment with context information. So we try to extract names of people that are making statements in those paragraphs and doing our best to identify them as researchers or people without scientific background. So going to the first research question that was posed earlier, can we find evidence for increased frequency of forward-looking statements? And the answer is yes and no, to be honest. So while the overall amount of articles increased in 2020 compared to 2019, we have a decline in the number of forward-looking statements, but only if you look at the total number of articles published. So actually, from all articles published in 2020, those that are related to the COVID-19 pandemic have a share of almost 16% that are forward-looking. So within this context, we have the most or the highest share of statements actually trying to make a forward-looking statement. And for the second question, can machine learning and the analysis of contextual data provide insight for scientific evidence base of the statement? We tried a 2-step approach. So for one, we tried to look up all the persons that we found within those text snippets and check them with the dimensions database. I think at least some of you will know this, to identify how many of them actually have publications in scientific publications or and actually the share among those that are making statements related to the pandemic is the highest again, but not by much, to be fair. And then in the second step, we wanted to find out, are they actually talking about something that is within their area of expertise? And for this, we employed something that's called the cosine distance or similarity, where you can basically compute how similar two statements are to each other. And we went ahead and compared all the statements that we had, or each singular statement, to the most recent abstracts that those persons published. And this measurement goes from 1, which has the highest similarity, to -1, which basically means that those two statements do not share a single word. and found actually quite encouraging results. So for the Anthony Fauci, we have a similarity score of 0.78 for a statement where he talks about possible positive impacts of vaccines. For a researcher called Beth Tarasawa that I have never heard of before, she was talking about effects of school closure, and I actually did some research, and she is a researcher on education policy. So again, area of expertise, I would say. And then just for good measure, Angela Merkel, so the German chancellor, she has a doctorate in physics. So she also shows up as someone who has scientific publications. But of course, this has nothing to do with making general political statements. So this is not her, I mean, it's the area of expertise in a way, but not of her scientific expertise. Yes, and with this very short overview on the machine learning results, I hand over to Dana.
Thank you, Jan. And I will finish up this talk by telling you a little bit about the challenges and opportunities we faced during our machine learning approach. Because as you can imagine, it's really hard to define a forward-looking statement. So that was the first challenge we faced. Of course, because knowledge assessment is an ongoing process and a dynamic process. So you're never finished with defining it. So that's also what we found out when trying to formulate what is the forward-looking statement. So we really ranged from looking through the results of this machine learning approach, from we saw weather forecasts, oh, this is forward-looking, but is this what we're targeting? So we really had a lot of discussions here. Another challenge was the language and selected data biases that you face with machine learning. Of course, we focused only on English-speaking text corpus data because integration of other languages would have been difficult. And also the selected data, we searched news articles, so we didn't search in academic papers, and this really biases the results, of course. Which doesn't mean that they aren't meaningful, but they have a tendency. Then we had the problem of disambiguation. Names are not unique, so sometimes we faced the problem of there were people with the same name, and the machine learning model, of course, couldn't differ between them. So we figured that experts are needed in all 4 phases of the machine learning process, because there are reoccurring sense-making processes that need to be done. And this is something that is really to be considered, which also leads me to the last point of a very time that machine learning or building up a machine learning model is a really time-consuming endeavor compared to targeted research conducted by a single person. So there should always be a reflection on the balance of costs and benefits. But nonetheless, we also found high potential in machine learning. As we found, it is an excellent basis for interdisciplinary exchange and to open up the knowledge assessment process. Because as you can see, we have different backgrounds. Jan is a machine learning specialist. Michaela specializes in open science communication. My background is in foresight. So we had really, really good discussions based on the machine learning results, and they fostered also our own sense-making process. So the next point is that machine learning also provides insights into science communication, because you get an idea on who is reporting on the future, and are the statements backed by scientific evidence. You get a hunch on that. And the last point is that machine learning might also broaden the knowledge base for foresight processes, because you can consider a really large amount of sources that you couldn't consider when doing it by hand. So, okay, so that's maybe I just wrap up the conclusions really quickly because we're out of time. So. We think that we're really aware and we acknowledge that machine learning is no guarantee for evidence, but nonetheless, we want to stress that those techniques are a nice heuristic tool that support knowledge assessment and sense-making processes with big data. We see the potential really in making more transparent this kind of interdisciplinary collaboration, because you can really fix it to, for example, the results of machine learning, those single text snippets. You can really discuss on them. You can put them back in the model and then comes out again, and you can discuss again, did it work? Did it help you in the sense making? Did it make the results more meaningful? So we think that also in the future, it might have a huge potential to open up this process, the sense-making process, to also maybe to the transdisciplinary approach by providing this kind of data visualization, data snippets, also to practitioners, also to stakeholders, and to integrate them in these kind of sense-making processes. So we think those insights for forward-looking and anticipatory science communication are really worthwhile, and we're happy to discuss with you and look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I have, again, a few questions that popped up, but with regard to the time, I would like to highlight our first speaker's question. Dr. Amelia Bonea asked, with regard to the increased visibility of experts, would you be able to comment on the gender dimension of this? E.g., has this pandemic also increased the visibility of women experts?
Draw conclusions there from the name to the gender would be really helpful for this kind of research question, but we don't have this resource, unfortunately.
So I'm so sorry. I think part of your response got cut off, at least for me. Maybe some people cannot, or yeah, maybe it was only us.
No, I was disconnected, sorry, but I heard that Jan took over, so I'm quite sure he gave a good answer to that, sorry. Maybe my fault with the internet connection, sorry.
I think it was my connection as well, so probably all of us.
Yeah.
Anyway, to sum it up briefly, this is very interesting. We would like to perform this kind of analysis, but it's very hard to guess the gender only by the name, especially if you don't know the name. So if you've never heard of it before, so it's not, there's no 100% way to be sure.
Yeah, thank you so much for this very fascinating and diverse and interdisciplinary perspective. I find it especially fascinating because I think one of my first questions was also related to looking forward statements, perhaps. So if you have, we have to unfortunately move forward just in the interest of time, but our speakers are still here. So please just feel free to post your questions in the chat. And well, yeah, let's thank our speakers again. And then I'm happy to present to you our final contribution of this lightning round session, which has been really lightning round for everyone. So thank you so much for keeping with the time and helping us along. So my colleague Christine is now going to start the video of our final speaker's contribution of Dr. Anna Berti-Suman, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology and Society. So Christine, I give it over to you.
So let me guide you through the story of a civic sentinel. So first of all, let me introduce you myself and the team I've been working with. So Anna Berti-Suman, I'm a Dutch Research Council postdoctoral fellow at the European Commission Joint Research Center. And I'm seconded here by the Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology and Society in the Netherlands. And the images that I will be sharing with you this afternoon have been realized by Alice, an artist, and we have been supported at Research Center. So we are presenting a work realized by the Sensing for Justice project, which researches the potential of citizen sensing, so environmental monitoring from the grassroots, as a source of evidence in environmental litigation and as a tool for mediation. We are witnessing emerging modes of engagement with crisis information, especially those related to environmental troubles. And all of these show a sort of new mode to engage with ongoing socio-ecological disasters that are emerging. Some of the pictures you will see in this presentation have been taken in Basilicata, a region in southern Italy afflicted by oil extraction, and where a number of environmental issues have been spotted and are associated with oil extraction in the region. And citizens there are monitoring and patrolling their land to report otherwise environmental challenges. So in a way, they are responding to silent disasters such as the long-term effects of oil extraction on their land. And think also to climate change and to what extent forms of civic science could contribute to map the raising troubles that climate change is causing, for example, to agriculture. But there are also more sudden disasters, such as the COVID pandemic that we saw unfolding, that are also mapped through forms of civic science. So we try to inspect these distinctive modes of engagement from the ground, and we've been physically present in Basilicata to research there the extent to which lay people, so non-expert people, were engaging with data, with evidence to report and, let's say, condemn environmental liabilities. So, in a sense, we are trying to disentangle powerful responses that are associated with the perception of being at risk. So humans can perceive to be physically or at level of their future at risk. And in a sense, we're looking not at bare protests in the streets, but really at forms of engagement in a creative way. So in a sense, the story that we are sharing this afternoon is an example of quoting Fleur Jones, staying with the trouble. So really the idea that's also in a sense Donna Haraway framed as not being overwhelmed by the problem, but really the need to face it. And in a sense, the way citizens are facing it on the ground is through civic monitoring, so through samples, through maps, through engagement, even through sensors. And citizen science could help in this landscape because it's not only providing a space to these people, but also evidence that it can be scientifically sound. And in fact, we saw many of these citizens really engaging with protocols, with true science, working close by with experts to really find a way to demonstrate that important environmental information was being silenced and in a sense was not properly shared with the citizen. So as you can see in this image, the idea of something hidden from the eyes of the grassroots. And in appropriating scientific tools, people are fighting informational monopolies. So the idea that the information is only with the authorities and lay people cannot access it. Or even in less conflicted scenarios, the idea that the authority just cannot cope with all the requests for information. And so citizens themselves can contribute to ensure that environmental information is made more open. So throughout the story that we tried to realize in a form of a graphic novel, so quite an innovative form for, let's say, sharing scientific results, we demonstrated, we try at least to give a spark for the role that citizen science can have in providing powerful evidence of environmental liabilities. And as you can see in this picture, a sentinel, civic sentinel, is taking a sample of soil contaminated with oil and water contaminated with oil associated with an oil extraction process. And this data ultimately can support claims, eventually also in courtrooms, to demonstrate that environmental rights have been violated. So let me jump. In a sense, this is the way to communicate and to demand environmental justice and oppose forms of environmental injustice that happen, for example, when animals and land become contaminated with oil. We decided to use the graphic novel approach because we think that this way, through drawings, we can communicate emotions. And adopting a swift, short, in a sense, more agile communication, like the one in a graphic novel, we trust we can reach more publics, we can reach even the youngsters and try to make the story of a civic sentinel accessible for many. We are going beyond, let's say, the oil contamination issue, because we are also using these visuals to communicate, for example, an important case that is occurring in Texas, where the grassroots could demonstrate massive plastic discharge by a petrochemical company in a bay waters. So, in a sense, we believe that the story of a civic sentinel in the version of a graphic novel could be a powerful way to engage different publics. And with that, I'd like to really welcome everyone joining our journey by downloading the method, the graphic novel, which is free and easily accessible online, and is also a resource that we are very happy to present in your endeavors in your schools. And I thank you for your attention, and I'd like to ask if there were any questions. Please also reach us on our website, on Sensing for Justice, on my Twitter, or contacting and asking us directly. I leave you in the hands of the artist of Alice, and I wish you a nice continuation of the conference.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing this fascinating video recording of your talk with us. I saw that Anna Bertelsmann is actually with us in the chat, and she has very helpfully shared some resources to link to the project. So I do encourage everyone to check it out. And yeah, as you saw, we have a little bit of time to receive some questions for Anna. And I saw that there have been some questions in the chat. I'm just gonna read it out. Anna, are you happy and comfortable to unmute yourself to answer them?
Yes, I hope that you can hear me well, because I have a quite unstable connection, but for the answer, and maybe at the end I'll show my video, so at least you can see me in face, because it's a bit detached this way.
Yeah, so we hear you just fine, at least I do. So I'm going to read it out, and then, yeah, please feel free. Does anyone know of any research being done in regards to crafting messages to evoke specific emotions when communicating science topics like hope or fear, and relationship between the independent variable emotion and dependent variable of resulting change in behavior after receiving a message, like an increase in engagement, decrease in problem factors? Okay, so I guess this is quite a general question, but Anna, would you like to answer it anyways?
Yes, thank you, Madeleine. And I think it's a great question. I can share at least from my experience with an experiment we did with the data visualization team from the Norwegian University. We tried to assess how people seeing visualization of basically migrants boats together with a project run by Forensic Architecture at Goldsmith, how looking at pulsing dots in a ocean map, people would kind of feel new emotion that they didn't feel before on migration. I would try to, let's say, extend this approach also to climate change, and to assess how people looking at maps of, for example, erosion of soil or melting glaciers could react even if they didn't, let's say, were empathic around climate science at all before. And we saw actually that this kind of visualization through maps of impactful topics would trigger emotions. Then we could really ask whether these people, after tracked the topic and started, would be an immense visualization. So, for example, the comics we realized sometimes managed to let's say, appreciate youth. So really the youngsters with emotions, and in general, even people that were not so empathic about, for example, environmental monitoring, they started be looking at how nicely the vignettes were looking. So I think it's a really, I'm looking for also more stable studies and long-term systemic studies on this connection between emotions and eventually action.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think your connection got a little bit disrupted, but I feel like we got the general point of your message, Anna. I see some nodding.
So yes, this would be it from my side.
Thank you so much. We have just a little bit more of time, so maybe if one of our previous speakers wants to jump in and maybe provide their own perspective, I think this is a opportunity to do so. And if you want to do that, just go ahead and unmute yourself. I will just, yeah, my co-host just raised my attention that we are already now finishing with our session slowly, which my heart is bleeding because I think we had so many interesting inputs and so many interesting questions. So of course, feel free to continue the conversation at your own time. And yeah, at this point, thank you so much again, everyone, for speaking. Thank you, everyone from the audience, for your wonderful questions and your engagement in the session. And I would like to also remind you that there is a continued program tonight. So it's actually just about to kick off. So there's maybe a short opportunity to take a small break, but then we have some networking events as well. So you could, for example, join the improv theater class, or you could also join a class on making cocktails, or simply get to meet your fellow conference attendees. And you can always do this through our conferencing platform. You can just register for the evening events. And with that, I want to wish you all a very wonderful evening, a wonderful rest of the conference. It was an absolute delight to host you. And this is the point where we say thank you, good night. I guess thank you for all the fish and good night.
Thank you, goodbye.
Thanks a lot, bye-bye.